So one other capability of the chat completions API is something called functions, and we didn't talk about that yet, but it's pretty cool. So you can also pass in addition to everything else, a functions parameter. And that allows you to provide a description of some function that you have that can be applied to the output before you finally give it back to the end user. And you can also define what parameters that function takes. ChatGPT can then embed function calls as part of its response. So if you tell it, for example, that you have a function that will tell you the current weather at a given position, maybe you tell ChatGPT as part of its functions parameter, hey, I have this function that can tell people what the weather is in a certain place. And you can give me parameters like where that place is and whether I want that to be in Celsius or Fahrenheit. So when you send ChatGPT a prompt that's something like, tell me the weather in Boston, it can come back and say, oh, well, you also told me you have a function that will actually give me the current weather. So I would like you to call that function, please, and tell me the results. And then I'll give you back a final answer. That's basically how it works here. So this allows you to embed your own data, your own functionality, your own capabilities into ChatGPT on top of it. It's kind of like how plugins work too. So let's just dive into an example and see how it works. It'll make more sense when you see it in action. All right, let's see functions in action, or tools as they call it now in the API. Start off as we did before, just instantiate a client, no big deal there, nothing unusual. And the first thing we need to do is define what our function is. So in this example, we're going to implement a system that can answer questions about what the current weather is. Now, naturally, ChatGPT itself has only been trained up to a certain point in time, right? So it doesn't actually know what the weather is right now. But let's imagine you could call some external service that does know what the weather is for a given place. Well, that's what this get current weather function would do. Now, I don't have a free weather service I can give you for this example, so we're just going to hard code some mock data here instead. So no matter where you're asking about, whether it's, Berlin or San Francisco or anywhere else in the world, it's always going to be 72 degrees and sunny with a pleasant little breeze as well. You can also pass in the units if you want Fahrenheit or Celsius here, although we're just going to ignore that and pass that back as the unit that comes back. It's going to be 72 no matter what in this example. Again, it's just dummy data for the sake of example. But this function just returns in JSON format what that weather information is. And if this were a real application, maybe you could call out to some web service to get real information. Go do that if you want, if you have access to something like that. All right, so let's look at the meat of this thing where we actually run the conversation here and work that function into the flow. So functions are just an extension to the chat completions API under what they call the tools parameter. So we're going to start off by passing in the prompt, which might be something like, what is the weather in Orlando, Florida, right? That just comes in as a standard user role, and the content is someone asking presumably about what the weather is. So now we need to set up this tools structure here. And within those tools, we can have individual functions. So the first function we're going to list here is called get current weather. We give it a description that says get the current weather in a given location. And that description is important. That's actually telling GPT what this function does. So if GPT sees a prompt coming in from the user that's talking about what is the weather in this place, it's going to know that maybe I can use this function to get more information about that before I give you a final answer. So we then define the parameters for that function. We say that you can specify a location, that is a string, and furthermore, we describe what format that should be in. So we're saying that we want the city and state specified, for example, San Francisco, California, the state code there. And this is enough to tell GPT how I want to format that information being passed into my function. It will actually go and give me structured data whenever it can figure it out to call my function with. That's pretty amazing, right? Furthermore, I would like to have the units as well, either Celsius or Fahrenheit, that you think that the user wants. However, only location is required. So if you don't know what unit they want, you can leave that off and I'll try to guess in my function, right? So there's a lot of magic going on here, right? Just based on those descriptions, that's all GPT needs to try to figure out exactly the structured data that I need to pass back to me to fulfill that function request. So let's go kick it off. We create a chat completions create call just like we did before, specify the latest and greatest model. If that gets deprecated on you, just update that to whatever the new one is. And we will pass in our array of messages thus far, which so far is just that single message with someone asking about the weather with that tool structure that specifies that we have a function that can give you more information about what the current weather is. We pass that tools in here as a tools parameter Tool choice is set to none, meaning that we're not going to force you to use a specific function. You can try to figure it out yourself, GPT. And then we just get a response back. We pick off the first choice if there's more than one. Let's print off that message response in its entirety just so we see what's in there. So this is a multi-step process. So now GPT might say, okay, I really want to get a function response before I give you a final answer. So if the response we got back contains something in tool_calls, that's our cue that we need to go call a function and give that back to GPT before it finishes its response. So we're going to start by populating this dictionary of available functions, mapping the function names to their actual function within this code. And then we just go and check what is the function name that we're trying to call from that message. So from that tool call structure, we're pulling out the function name that GPT wants us to call. We just match that up to our map here to figure out what that actual function is and go off and call it. And then we pass in the function arguments that also got passed in from GPT, which at a minimum, again, will be the location in city, state format. We'll go off and actually call that function with those arguments. So we start by appending that response that we got back asking for more information to our chain of messages. And then we add another message as a tool role that contains an ID that matches the one that came in from that message response. We give it the name of the function we called, and finally, the actual function response that contains our answer to what is the weather in whatever city you said, okay? So the syntax here is important to get right. It's a little bit finicky, but here's a good example of how to do it. Fundamentally, though, all we've done is we've asked GPT, what's the weather in a given place? Here are the functions I have available that can help you with that query. GPT came back and said, okay, I have something in tool calls that I want you to actually call that function. Give me the answer back. We put that response back in that we got back as well as the answer that it asked for in this structure here. We then send that new list of messages off that includes that answer back to chatcompletions.create, and our final response will come back as the message response there. So let's go give it a try. Python functions.py. Ask me about the weather somewhere. What is the weather in Orlando, Florida? Because that's where I am. And we can see what's going on here. So we can see the first thing that comes back is a call back from the assistant role saying, I want to call a function. And I want to call the function you registered that's called getCurrentWeather with these arguments. The location is Orlando, Florida. I don't know what the units are because I didn't specify what the units should be. That's okay. So go ahead and please call this function for me and give that result back to me, and then I'll give you another answer. So that's what I do. We append the function response to the conversation. That is, Orlando, Florida has a temperature of 72. Units are null because I didn't say what they were, and the forecast that I got back was sunny and windy. I pass that back to ChatGPT, and here's the final response it gives us. The weather in Orlando, Florida is currently sunny and windy with a temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And this time, it did not come back as a function call. It came back with an actual choice with a message in it. So I can display that to the end user. And it shows me the total cost in terms of tokens that I used to do all that. So that's an example of using functions. Let's actually try another one where we actually do the units as well. So I can say, what is the weather in Seattle, Washington in Celsius? And this time you can see the unit of Celsius kind of magically got extracted from that by ChatGPT and passed back to me as a requested function parameter. So the response I finally get in the end is the current weather in Seattle, Washington is 72 degrees Celsius with a sunny and windy conditions. Note that my function didn't have any logic within it to convert between Fahrenheit and Celsius, so it's taking the number I gave it on faith. But that's pretty neat, right? So that gives you a way of incorporating domain-specific information specific to your organization, or just newer information than what GPT was trained on, and incorporating that into your chat responses. Pretty neat stuff.